Today we have a very distinct honor of conferring a Doctor of Laws degree, honoris causa, this morning to our distinguished guest, Judge Andrew Napolitano. And today to provide the introduction to the judge and assist with the robing is Associate Dean Alan Mendenhall.
Well, it is my honor and privilege to introduce my friend, Judge Andrew Napolitano. Judge Napolitano is a graduate of Princeton University and the University of Notre Dame Law School, and the youngest life-tenured Superior Court judge in the history of the state of New Jersey, where he served on the bench from 1987 to 1995. As a judge, he presided over more than 150 jury trials. He has served as a legal analyst at Fox News since 1998 and has taught constitutional law and jurisprudence at Delaware Law School and Seton Hall Law School. He is an advisory board member of the Blackstone Burke Center for Law and Liberty here at Faulkner University. He's a distinguished visiting professor at Brooklyn Law School, and he's distinguished scholar in law and jurisprudence at the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. He's the author of 9 books, including Suicide Pact, Theodore and Woodrow, Dred Scott's Revenge, The Constitution in Exile, and Constitutional Chaos. His writing has appeared in several places, among them the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Times, and he is probably a familiar face to everybody in this room. Judge Napolitano, would you please join me at the podium?
Judge Andrew Napolitano, it is my pleasure to confer on you the Doctor of Laws degree, honoris causa, and all rights and privileges aptitude and pertaining. Thank you.
Thank you, President Wilson, Dean Nelson, graduates, friends, family. When I told my 91-year-old mother that I was going to be spending the day in Alabama, she said to me, "Where's that?" So for this Italian, New Jersey, pre-Vatican II, Latin Mass attending Roman Catholic to be down in the Deep South is a joy and a triumph. I said to her, "Mother, it's in the South." She said, "Where? Southern Italy?" I said, "No, the southern part of the United States, a great part where Jesus Christ reigns in the hearts of men and women." The reason I'm here is in 30 years of teaching the Constitution to various settings, only once, as far as I know, did I teach a student who knew more about the Constitution than I do. And that is Dean Mendenhall, who just introduced me here. I think you probably know these lines. Some men say the earth is round, and some men say it is flat. But if it is flat, could the king's command make it round? And if it is round, could an act of parliament make it flat? These are the words used by Sir Thomas More when he was summing up before a jury defending himself against the charge of treason. The alleged, and under the horrific law at the time, act of treason consisted of silence. His refusal to acknowledge that King Henry VIII was the head of the church in England. For that refusal, he was convicted and, of course, beheaded. He knew he was going to lose the trial. The jury and the judges had stacked everything against him, so he made his argument for posterity. He was not only appealing to the jurors' common sense, of course the king can't make a round earth flat, and of course Parliament can't make a flat earth round. He was appealing to their understanding of the order of things, to the magnificence of order in the world, to what we today call the natural law. He was appealing all the way back to Aristotle and Plato, and eventually to Thomas Aquinas, and this would, after him, be picked up by John Locke and eventually Thomas Jefferson, who would write in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When Jefferson wrote those words, and the 55 others signed the Declaration of Independence with him, and all of them risked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honors to defy the mightiest army and the mightiest navy the world had ever known in order to secede from Great Britain. They wedded to the United States of America at its birth the concept of the natural law, the idea that God created the universe, a knowing, intelligent, purposeful God, and gave us the ability through reason to discover the laws of the universe. And in order to exercise our reason to discover the laws of the universe, he gave us something that he possesses in abundance: perfect freedom. The freedom to do well and the freedom to do ill. That, my friends, the concept that our freedom comes from our humanity and our humanity comes from the Creator, is the essence of the natural law. Now, what I've just summarized is not a surprise and is not novel to any of you who are graduating today, because you graduate from a school where this very fundamental principle is not only taught, it is required. When you take the bar exam and pass the bar exam and practice law, you will have a leg up on almost all of your colleagues and adversaries who graduated from other schools where the fundamental first principles of why we do what we do are not emphasized the way they are here. This is a great gift to you, and you must use this gift for good. So we fought a revolution, we won the revolution, we wrote a constitution, we decided that in the Constitution we would characterize certain rights as immune from government reach because they come from our humanity. These rights are, for the most part, articulated in the first 8 amendments to the Constitution. Everybody knows these words. Everybody that graduates from law school knows these words. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. There are, of course, other rights in the First Amendment as well. So your right to think as you wish, to say what you think, your right to develop your own personality. I've often told some of my Fox colleagues they should be grateful that that's a natural right. Yeah. Your right to worship or not to worship, your right to keep and bear arms and defend yourself, which, by the way, is not the right to shoot deer, it's the right to shoot tyrants if they take over the government. Your right to be left alone, your right to be treated fairly by the government. These rights don't come from government, they come from our humanity. The First Amendment doesn't say Congress shall grant the freedom of speech. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, recognizing that it is pre-political, that it existed before the government did, that it came from our humanity, and our humanity comes from God. We won the revolution. We wrote the Constitution. George Washington was president. John Adams was his vice president. Then Adams ran for president and got elected. And he didn't talk to his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration. Why didn't they talk? Remember how they were elected in those days? Everybody ran for president. Could you imagine this today? Whoever won became president. Whoever finished second became vice president. Of course, that was changed after the conflicts between Adams and Jefferson. But in Adams' administration, we're now talking 1792 to 1796, 96 to 80. There spread through the country something that we couldn't imagine today: fear of the French. French were having a revolution. They cut off the king's head. They cut off the queen's head. People were worried the same thing would happen here. So the Congress decided to enact an abominable piece of legislation called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically said, we want people to come to the United States. Come here, buy some land. You can become a citizen in 6 months, unless you're French. Then it will take you 14 years. By the way, anyone who shall criticize the president or the government with an untruth shall be subject to prosecution and incarceration for 2 years. Now that's a head scratcher. How could the same generation, in some cases the same human beings, that had just written, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, enact a statute that punished speech? More about the reasons for that in a few minutes. But a congressman I have often admired from Vermont, an anti-federalist, a small government person who couldn't stand John Adams, decided to challenge this legislation. He knew that if he challenged the legislation on the floor of the House of Representatives, he couldn't be prosecuted because of the speech and debate clause in the Constitution, which insulates members of Congress for what they say on the floor. So he decides to confront President Adams in the street. Now, Adams had a problem that afflicts a lot of middle-aged men. He had a problem with his waistline. In order to disguise the waistline, Mrs. Adams sewed him a purple robe. And in order to make the purple robe look a little more flattering, she put gold epaulets on the shoulders. So here you had the elected president of the United States walking in the mud of unpaved streets in the brand new Washington, D.C., dressed just like George III, against whom we had fought the Revolutionary War. When this congressman from Vermont comes up to him and calls him your pomposity, he sort of laughed at that. And the next day he called him, good morning, your rotundity. And for that, a congressman by the name of David Wagner was prosecuted for violating the Alien and Sedition Acts by uttering an untruth about the President of the United States. Everybody thought this was a joke. He was prosecuted, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 2 years in a prison in western Pennsylvania. And while he was there, he did the unthinkable. If you are from New Orleans or Chicago or Hudson County, New Jersey, you are familiar with what he did in jail. He ran for re-election from his jail cell. And he won. And when he returned to Washington, D.C., expecting to mock his pomposity, he found that his pomposity was no longer in the White House. Instead, a tall, thin, red-haired fellow named Thomas Jefferson was, who proceeded to pardon the congressman, welcome back to the Capitol, and return the farm that the government had seized from him because he mocked the president. Things are going okay. Fast forward to 1812, the British are trying to take back the United States, or we're trying to invade Canada. It's a little ambiguous as to what caused the war, but the British are marching through Upper Marlborough, Maryland, when they encamp for the night, and they seize 5 townsfolk and threaten to hang them in the morning. And the mayor, John Hodges, directs the local militia to seize 5 members of the British platoon and threaten to hang them in the morning, and they're sort of at a standoff. Hodges then, unarmed, unaccompanied, walks right into the British encampment and says, can we make a deal? Can we return your 5 troops for our 5 townsfolk? Shakes hands with the captain, the troops are released, the townsfolk are released. 5 months later, the war is over. There are tumultuous celebrations all over the country, particularly in Upper Marlborough, Maryland, where the mayor, John Hodges, is the grand marshal of the parade. And everybody's there. The federal people are there. The state people are there. The townsfolk are there. Everybody's praising him to the skies. I hope what happened to him doesn't happen to me when I walk off this podium. He finished giving this speech, walked off the podium, and 2 strangers approached him. One put shackles on his hands and ankles, and the other handed him a piece of paper, an indictment obtained by a grand jury in Washington, D.C. for treason, providing aid and comfort to the enemy in wartime. Now John Hodges is tried for treason, in a court in the town where the jurors are the people who celebrated his victory. The judge was the one who introduced him at the end of the parade. The government stands up and says, we don't have any evidence to present. Everybody knows what he did. He provided aid and comfort to the enemy in wartime by returning their soldiers to them. Defense stands up and says, everybody in this room knows what he did. He saved the lives of 5 innocent members of this town from being hanged by the invader, and in part caused a victory in the war. Judge says to the jurors, gentlemen, there were no ladies in the juries in those days. We've reserved a room for you in the tavern across the street. After you finish consuming your meal and the tavern keeper's best ale, imagine that in a jury room today, we want you to tell us whether or not Mayor Hodges is guilty or not guilty. Foreperson raises his hand and says, Judge, we already know the answer. We've already decided. The mayor is not guilty. The first example of jury nullification in which a bunch of farmers in Western Maryland said to the federal government, leave us alone. Now, there's a footnote to this story, and the footnote is this. If you've worked in the Justice Department, you know this. There have only been 7 prosecutions for treason in the history of the country. This was one of them. And since treason is the rare crime for which the defendant may be executed, even if the defendant didn't cause any death by his own hands, the government has a rule that requires the President of the United States personally to consent to the treason prosecution. Who was the President of the United States in 1812? James Madison. What did he do earlier in his life? Wrote the Constitution. So the world must look very different on the inside possessing power than on the outside challenging it. And you, as young lawyers, must be aware of this defect in humanity. The defect, which arguably comes from the fall of Adam and Eve, is libido dominandi. No, not that kind of libido. Libido dominandi is the lust to dominate, the lust to use power from whatever source derived to tell other people how to live their lives. I've scratched my head, I've researched and read and written and spoken and analyzed and challenged for 40 years over how the same people that wrote Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, who challenged the King of England for suppressing their speech, could have done the same thing to others, their fellow Americans, once they achieved power. And I am convinced that St. Augustine was right when he warned that the great defect, because of the fall, is libido dominandi, and you must guard against it. You must guard against it in those you send to the seats of power. You must guard against it if you are one of those who comes to the seat of power, and you must be wary of it when you are trying a case because the judge gets his or her paycheck from the government and has that power to dominate. Challenge that power. Don't blithely accept its use. Now, we are really here today because of one man, a man of triumph and contradiction, a man who absorbed horrific pain for the rest of us, a man hated by some and loved by others. The man, of course, is Jesus Christ, whose Father gave us the freedom that we celebrate, the freedom to dominate others, the freedom to liberate others. 4 salesmen were rushing through O'Hare Airport late to make a plane when they inadvertently knocked over a tray, a cart of a woman selling apples. They sort of laughed at her as the apples went flying all over the place because they were determined to make this plane. O'Hare is enormous if you've never been there. About a quarter of a mile from where this event occurred, still not at the gate, one of them had misgivings. And he said to the others, this is in an era before cell phones, would you call my wife and tell her I'll be there? I'm going to have to take a later plane. Tell her I'll be there. He ran back to help the young woman that was selling the apples to pick them up. The apples were all over the place. After about 10 seconds with her, he realized she was blind. She was on her hands and knees picking up these smashed apples. She said to him, "Are you Jesus Christ?" And he said, "No, far from it. Why do you ask me that?" "Well, because when the apples were turned over, I said, 'Heavenly Father, send Jesus Christ to help me.' And then I heard a voice saying, 'Tell her I'll be right there.' And it was your voice. Are you sure you're not Jesus Christ?" "No, ma'am, I'm not Jesus Christ." He looked at the apples. They were smashed and destroyed. He took five $20 bills out of his pocket, handed them to the woman, threw out the bad apples, and then left. Can you imagine conforming your life at an unexpected time, at an unpredictable moment, so that a stranger you never met and will never see again can say to you, "Are you Jesus Christ?" I love JFK's inaugural address. There's a lot of great one-liners in it, but my favorite is this. "In the long history of the world, only a few generations will be granted the role of defending freedom in its maximum hour of danger." Now, this is me. That's the Jefferson quote. I think that maximum hour is coming. And I think you are that generation. Some of you may defend freedom and suffer for it. Some of you may defend freedom and suffer horrifically for it. I defend freedom every day. I'm 66 years old. I expect that when I die, I will die in my bed, surrounded by those who love me. That may not happen to all of you. Some of you may die defending freedom, faithful to first principles, in a government prison. And some of you may have to die faithful to first principles in a public square, to the sound of the government's trumpets blaring. When these moments come, you will know what to do. Because freedom, the great gift from God the Father, the one thing we share in him with him to perfection, lies in each human heart and in every human heart. But it must do more than just lie there. Thank you for bringing this Italian kid from New Jersey into the South. God bless you. God love you.